page Chav Zayin, we are up to the 11th of the 13 midos. Ha-Yud Aleph, the 11th. Yud being 10, Aleph being 1. So Ha-Yud Aleph means the 11th of the midos, and that's called Chesed LaAvraham. Chesed LaAvraham. God acts with us in a way of Chesed, which is similar to the Chesed of Avraham. Last session we discussed some more about the Spheros, Chesed and Devorah and Tiferes. Chesed to the right, Devorah to the left, Tiferes to the middle. Chesed corresponding to Avraham, and Devorah corresponding to Yitzchak, and Tiferes corresponding to Yaakov. This is then going more into the detail of Chesed Avraham. Titan Emes Yaakov comes before Chesed Avraham in the order of the midos that are here. I'm not quite sure why, but in any case, we've emphasized, maybe more of the discussion about the midah of Yaakov and Torah and Emes and Tiferes, but today it's more going to be focusing on the first midah, that of Avraham and Chesed. We spoke then about how Avram's midah was that of Chesed. We mentioned just that Avraham and Sarah gave indiscriminately to anybody who was in need, and they were providing for them not only physically, but they actually used the physical provisions to provide for people's spiritual needs as well. And therefore, wayfarers that were traveling around in the desert and needed different things. So Avraham and Sarah had this tent, which they accepted wayfarers, and they provided for them with food and lodgings, and that was an opportunity to do kiruv on them and let them know about Hashem. And therefore, primarily, they were interested in giving to people spiritually, bequeathing to people the spiritual truths that Avraham and Sarah had attained through their relationship with God. But they provided for people's physical needs as well. So both physically and spiritually, Avraham's midah was that of Chesed, was giving. And there are different types of Chesed. We mentioned in one of the previous sessions that if God's attributes are good, and God is perfect, that means that God's attribute of goodness would be perfect. We were talking about this more in the context of God's purpose for creation. God's purpose of creation was in order to bestow of His goodness upon a recipient. Where the idea that we suggested there was that if someone is good but doesn't share that good, so that good can only be limited. Rather, the goodness in a full sense would require sharing of that good with others, so that there should be a recipient of that good. But there might be a scenario where a person's goodness is given to another, but given in a way which is not good. So even though the person is sharing that goodness with others, the fact that it is in a way which is not good is lacking. And what example might that be? Say, for example, a person gives to somebody else, but makes that person feel beholden for having received that good. So even though the person's good is being shared with the others, being shared in a way where the recipient feels bad about receiving the good, and therefore it diminishes from the good. God's perfect attribute of goodness dictates that God should give of His goodness and enable the recipient to feel good about receiving that good. And we discussed this in the context of reward. And therefore a person feels like they deserve the good that they get, and therefore feel good about receiving that good. And they don't feel beholden, because people are created with the sensation as if they're deserving the good that they actually receive. So, God could, for example, give in order to fill people's needs. But the truth is that God doesn't have to create such that there would be needs that He would come to fulfill. And therefore, that points to the direction of a higher form of giving, where the giving is not just to fulfill the need of somebody, but the giving for the act of giving itself. And therefore, these are two major kind of expressions of giving. The one form of giving is when I recognize somebody's lacking something, so I give them what they need in order to make up for what they're lacking. Another form of giving, which is even higher than that, which is I'm really not focused as much on what this person needs, but focusing on my ability and desire to give. Of course, I want to make sure that what I'm giving is going to be good for the recipient. But the point is, assuming my intention to give is truly altruistic, So the motive or the incentive, the motivation for giving is not just because I'm aware of there being the need, but because I want to give, just for the act of giving itself. That's the type of chesed that we're talking about, chesed la'Avraham. Okay? I mean, it's true, on one level, Avraham was recognizing the physical and spiritual needs of people, and therefore trying to provide for fulfilling those needs. But in truth, that wasn't coming from the desire to fulfill something that was lacking, but actually from Avraham's attribute of giving, his innate attribute of chesed, of giving, which is independent of fulfilling a person's need. And Avraham learned this from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He learned this from the attributes of God. And Avraham looked around the world, and he saw, look at God's wonderful creation. It's the epitome of the act of giving. But it's the form of giving which is not giving to fulfill or make up for something that's lacking, because Avraham realized that God didn't have to create in the first place such that there would be a creation that would be in need of receiving. So therefore, he extrapolated and understood that the ultimate form of giving is not to fulfill the need, it's the act of giving itself. And this is where Avraham's attribute of giving comes from. The chesed of Avraham is like the chesed of Hashem, which is for the pure purpose of expressing God's goodness and giving, independent of the fact that he's fulfilling some need. Right? If it's just about fulfilling a need, so don't create with a need, and don't give, and don't fulfill the need. You see that the creation was actually a manifestation of God's attribute of giving, which was perfect. That touches on the point of free will. The point is, just the act of creation must have been motivated purely from God's desire to give, and not because there was any need of the recipient, because before creation there was no recipient. Okay? So this is some of the kind of introductory ideas to what he's referring to here when he talks about chesed la'Avraham. So, hem hamisnahagim ba'olam lifnim mishur hasadin ka'Avraham Avinu. These people who are acting in this form of chesed, they act in loving kindness towards the world in a way which is lifnim mishur hasadin, and that's a term that we referred to in the previous meeting that we did, going kind of within the letter of the law. Okay? And I think there we discussed that a person could decide to say, well, listen, a person who, let's say, goes within the letter of the law, I'll go in the letter with them. And a person who doesn't, a person who goes according to the strict letter of the law, which we said is kosher, that's acceptable. It might not be the most desirable way of behaving, but it's certainly not a prohibition. He calls upon the Torah law and he acts strictly according to that. So, if this is how he acts, so I'll act that way with him. We said, no, a person shouldn't do that. Rather, we should learn from Hashem that even people who are going according to the strict Shur Sadin, he still cuts them slack, so we should also do the same thing. That was like a basic summary of what we said in the previous Mita. And somebody asked, I think it was you, Michael, somebody asked, so ultimately, what's the difference then between the one who goes within the Shur Sadin and one who doesn't, if for all intents and purposes, practically speaking, God acts benevolently with all? So he said it must be a matter of degrees. That a person who acts lifnim mishur hasadin, he's always cutting people slack, giving them the favor of the doubt, being generous beyond what's necessary, they're going to receive a greater degree of that response from God than a person who's going according to the strict letter of law. Even if God is cutting him slack and being benevolent, and with him, it's going to be to a lesser degree. Here, this is one step further, and we'll see how it's played out. He says, "Gam HaKadosh Baruch Hu misnayagim ahem lifnim mishur hasadin." With these people who are always or regularly acting in this magnanimous and benevolent type of way, God is always going to be acting with them this way as well. Einu ma'amidim ahem hadin al tokfai. And he doesn't call them to strict judgment or justice. Af lo b'derech hayosher. Even when that would be the straight and correct path. Ela nichnasi mehem lifnim min hayosher. Rather, he goes with them in a way which is, like we've said, beyond the letter of the law, beyond the straight path. There's nothing wrong particularly with the letter of the law. And that's benonim. The average people actually act that way. These righteous people don't do that. Therefore, God doesn't do that with them either. He acts with them kamo shem misnahagim, as they act. So that, for example, there's a pasuk which says, Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. God is like your shadow on your right hand. God shadows you on your right hand. So what does that mean? Just as a person moves, so his shadow moves together with him. Right? Basically, his hand shadows him. Right? So God shadows a person as well. The moves that a person makes, God shadows those moves. And therefore, if a person's moves are with the right hand, meaning of chesed, Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha, God is your shadow on your right hand. If you are moving in a rightwardly, meaning a chesed directed manner, so God shadows you in that direction as well. The person might ask, it says in verses, that God will not take shochad. He will not take, what's the word for shochad? Bribery. You can't bribe God. What you do right, you get rewarded. What you do wrong, you don't. So what's this business about saying, well, if I go within the Shur Sidin, so God is going to also act that way with me? What about the transgressions that a person does?
It's not negated.
It's not negated. We're very good. We saw that. The transgressions would not be negated, right? The transgressions would not be negated. And it was in the attribute of Over al Pesha, I believe, that we saw that idea. That what God does is, He, even though the rewards are reckoned separately than the transgressions, God will forbear those transgressions in order to give the person the opportunity to do tshuva and therefore neutralize them so that he gets his full reward. Okay? But let's say a person doesn't do that. So he's got these transgressions hanging over his head, and he's got these. So because he acts nicely with people, or he goes beyond the letter of law regarding laws having to do with God, so he's going to be treated that way. What about all his transgressions? Okay, so one way of your answering is that the transgressions are going to have to be reckoned with, and then he's going to have his, let's say, rewards. But if that's the scenario, then if you're only dealing with the rewards, so how is it applicable to say that God is going to go the extra mile for this person, or take him within the letter of the law? That doesn't seem to be something applicable for the mitzvos. Those are being rewarded. So the question remains, which is, again, if he gets rewarded for the mitzvos and he gets punished for the averos, and God is a true judge, and God does not accept bribery, you can't say, well, I'm going to do this and that and the other, go the extra mile for God, whether it be things having to do with other people or they're having to do with the mitzvos. So how can we understand the idea that God is going to be benevolent and magnanimous to him as well? What about his transgressions? God doesn't accept these mitzvahs as bribery against his transgressions. So one answer to this question is that God set up in the world in a way which is Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. God is your shadow on your right hand. God shadows you according to your acts of chesed. So that if you act in ways of chesed, God goes there with you. He shadows you. It's like a law of nature. It's a law of creation. God follows you like this. Yeah? So the result of this is that when a person acts in a way of chesed, we say that God also acts with this person in a way of chesed. That's not bribery. That's din. That's the law. That's the judgment. When a person acts in ways which are specially magnanimous and benevolent, the world is set up in a way that God shadows the person and goes there with him. And as a result of this, the transgressions that he does are not being overlooked or not being mitigated or not being neutralized or minimized because this person is given some kind of spiritual bribery to God. It's not a payoff. That is the din. The din is when you act in ways of chesed, So God goes with you in those ways of chesed. Let me give you an example, if we bring this idea down to halacha, right? There are scenarios where, let's say, a person damages another person, and he's responsible for paying for the damage that he does. There are certain scenarios where he's not really obligated as far as the strict halacha is concerned in order to pay this person damages. Let's say, for example, he doesn't actually directly cause damage to the person, but he does something which is called grama. He does something which indirectly causes damage to the person, where, technically speaking, he's exempt from paying damages because he didn't do the damage. It only came around indirectly, and it wasn't directly foreseeable that this action would cause the damage. If it was foreseeable that this act would cause the person damage, even though it's indirect, that would be tantamount to damaging directly. The point is, damage is caused to the other person in a way which is not entirely foreseeable, and only indirectly. So the halacha is he's exempt. He doesn't have to pay him back. Right? So what do you mean? If you weren't doing what you were doing, even if it only caused an indirect effect, I would have been damaged. So ultimately it comes from you. It doesn't come from me. If things were just left as they were, if you never went up on the roof and did X, so it wouldn't have resulted in indirect result Y, which would cause me damage Z. So ultimately, Torah says no. He went up there and did X, it's true, but Y was an unforeseeable, and therefore if it caused indirectly, not unforeseeable, damage Z, so that's no different than if a storm came and caused the same type of damage. This person can't be held accountable for that. He's exempt. That's called grama. Okay, grama. Indirect, unforeseeable damage. Nevertheless, there is a responsibility, there's a legal requirement to pay him at least a third of the damage, what's called lifnim mishuras hadin. There's a halachic requirement to go lifnim mishuras hadin. Do you have to do it? No. You don't have to go lifnim mishuras hadin. Yeah? You don't have to. But if you want to go lifnim hadin, there's a halachic basis for that. How do you decide whether the person has to go lifnim mishuras hadin, he has to go the extra mile, or not? It's brought down in Hoshe Mishpat. Yeah, there's a chiyuv on lifnim mishuras hadin, which you're not required to do. It's a kind of a fine line here. Yeah. What's that? Grum is pater. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Grum is pater mikra. Then there's a chiyuv lifnim mishuras hadin to pay shlish, to pay a third. So make up your mind. Either it's halacha or it's lifnei mishuras hadin. One way of determining whether you go on this is, right, how is this person normally? What is it? If this is a person who's consistently lifnei mishuras hadin person, so he's required, in this instance as well, to go lifnei mishuras hadin. You might say, so he ends up losing out. A good person who's magnanimous and benevolent and takes other people's is going to be losing here because there's a chiyuv. Why? We require consistency. Yeah, but the point here is as follows. It's a two-way street. Just like this person consistently goes lifnei mishuras hadin, he gets certain privileges as a result of that. Which is what? That God goes lifnei mishuras hadin with him as well. As a chiyuv. As a responsibility. As a requirement. And that's what I'm talking about here. In this scenario, right, when a person is consistently being what I'm saying, lifnei mishuras hadin, benevolent and so forth and so on, so he's actually causing God to fulfill what we said, Hashem tzilcha ad yad yaminecha. He's your shadow on your right hand. And when, as a result of that, God forgoes the transgressions, that's not bribery. That's law. Why? Because this person normally acts in the lifnei mishuras hadin, so he actually causes God to be required to act with him lifnei mishuras hadin. In which case, it's a halacha, as it were. God is required to do this. And it's not shochad. So therefore, God, I don't take shochad. If you're the type of person who normally says, din, and for example, you cause somebody damage, and the halacha says you're required to pay the lifnei mishuras hadin, and you're the type of person who says, that halacha is not relevant to me, because I don't live my life that way. I'm like your average person. What I'm required to do, I do. What I'm not required to do, I don't do. Yeah. So when it comes time to be reckoned Shemayim, transgression, the person says, God, can't you cut me some slack? Wait a minute. You didn't cut slack to other people. And you never brought yourself into the category of requiring yourself to cut slack to others. So you certainly can't, as it were, require me, God, to cut slack for you. That would be shochad. That would be bribery. Bribery I don't take. Right? If you made going the finishes in a halacha, a consistent way of life for yourself, so you're actually causing God, right, to act that way with you, halachically speaking, as it were. But if not, no. So this is what he's talking about here. Yeah? Einu ma'amidi mehen hadin al tokfo. And there are cases in the Gemara which talk about certain scenarios like of monetary requirements. There's this story of, I think it was Rabbi Bar Hana, who his workers broke a jug of his or something, so he I don't know, he had some clothing of theirs, and he held back the clothing as collateral against the pitcher that they broke. And they came to another rabbi, and they said, the rabbi's holding our clothing, our cloaks, as collateral against the barrel that we brought. So the rabbi told the other rabbi, basically, the rabbi came and asked him what he should do. And he said, you're required to pay them back. The Gemara kind of required. He's not required in that case. Why does the rabbi use the language required? Because he was talking about another rabbi who's consistently does and expected to be consistent in going l'fnei Radin, becomes halachically required to pay back, to absorb the loss here and not take the collateral of the workers. Right? So, on the one hand, like I said, that kind of exposes one to obligation. On the other hand, it also merits for himself a certain privilege, which is, since he becomes obligated to act this way, it also obligates, as it were, God to act commensurately with him as well and cut slack for all of these transgressions that he has. So this would be the type of chesed, Lavram, the chesed that is done to people who are consistently being benevolent, magnanimous, and going midifnim mishur sedin with other people. And he doesn't demand money from people, he doesn't demand judgment from people, even though the halacha would permit him to do so. He doesn't do that. Like the example I gave. He said, well, I'm not required to pay you. I'm not required to pay you. But he does it anyway. So such people, God acts with them, just like they act. Vainu chesed l'Avraham, and this is what we mean by chesed l'Avraham. This is chesed l'Avraham. It's not just referring to providing for people when they need it, right? It's providing for people even when you don't have to give, even when you're not required to give. It's giving for giving's sake. In the cases that we're talking about, it kind of boils down to that. There's really no need to pay this person. If you do so, you're giving for giving's sake. Because maybe morally, ethically, on a higher standard, this is what you view as being required to do. I'll give you another example of this. There's a halacha that a person whose children cause damage to another person is exempt, he's patur. Your child takes a hammer out of your house and he goes smashes somebody's window. You're exempt. You didn't do it, the child did, and the child is exempt because he doesn't have any das, and he doesn't have like full knowledge or consciousness of what he's doing. The person will say, I'm exempt. I don't have to pay. Somebody comes up, this kid took a hammer, he smashed my window. I mean, if the guy was irresponsible for leaving the hammer out in a place which is accessible to the child, I don't know what the case would be there. He might just also be patur. But whatever, maybe the hammer is not a good example. But let's say the child of his own doing does something that causes damage to somebody. So technically speaking, you're pater. You're exempt from having to pay that person. Again, it's like, say it's no different than some natural disaster that might have happened and caused the person damage. It has nothing to do with me. It was just my kid. The person could claim exemption. Right? But a person who goes lifnim mishuras hadin would say, "I'm very sorry, apologize. How much did it cost? Here's the money. Let's fix your window."
You pay 1/3, or you pay the full amount.
You're not required to pay anything. In that case, you're not required to pay anything. Not even lifnim mishuras hadin. It's even more lenient than the previous case that I was talking about. That's why I chose to talk about the previous case, because there's really a halachic requirement. There's a basis in halacha to pay the third. Here there's no basis whatsoever. This would be taking the Nifnor Shadim to even further extent. So I guess if you're going to pay, you could choose to pay whatever part you want up to all of it. I guess that would be a personal choice that one would make. The person could say, of course, halachically speaking, I'm exempt. But I feel bad, and I'd like to at least be able to contribute something. And a person might say, you know what? If you want to pay, pay. If you're not going to pay, don't do this half stuff. That person might say that. Thank you very much. It would have to depend. It might depend on the scenario. If it were a non-religious neighbor, and the kind of general mentality for this type of thing is that a person should take responsibility for his children, then it would probably be not a nice idea to say, well, the Torah exempt me, so I don't have to, but I'll begrudgingly give you half. If you're going to give something, so maybe there it would be better to pay, to pay all of it. Or a person say, look, strictly speaking, as far as the halacha is concerned, I'm not required to pay, and the truth is I really don't have the ability to pay, but I still feel bad, and I'm going to go, beyond my means, at least, and help pay for half. I hope you appreciate that. It's going to vary from scenario to scenario, but the general point was just that this would be an example of going lifnim mishuras hadin, where you're totally exempt according to halacha from paying. You still might, a person who wants to lifnim mishuras hadin would say, feel very bad. Can I at least help over here? Whatever. I don't know. What are we going to say?
The only difference, I lost if you're going to compare the two cases.
The first case was talking about a case of grama, where an adult does a knowing action which has a secondary unforeseeable result causing damage. So there, the damage is much, even though it's indirect, it's still it's considered to be much more closely related to this person's actions. He did action A. It caused result B, which caused damage C. It's an example of grama. Let's say you were working on some pipe, and the pipe was connected to a neighbor's pipe, and you're working on your own pipe, and through working on your pipe, and the connection between the two pipes causes damage to the other person's pipe. And it wasn't really particularly foreseeable. It's not like they were rusty old pipes where you should have thought, well, if I move this one, it's likely to break that one. But you were working normally on your own pipe, but then by virtue of the fact it was connected to that one, it shouldn't really have caused damage, but you ended up causing damage to that person's pipe. So that would be a case of grama. Right? So you weren't working on his pipe; you're working on your own pipe. Your work on your own pipe caused damage onto the connected to his pipe. You put putter. It's grama.
But then in the latter cases,
That was a child. Your child, a person's child causes damage, has nothing to do with him whatsoever.
That's not a grama.
No. Again, if he puts the hammer in the kid's hand, so that might be a different story. But we're talking about the child is outside playing. He takes a stone in his hand. He just takes up a rock and he throws it at a car, breaks the window. You're not responsible for that.
They're
Not responsible.
For the kid.
Yeah, there's no.
In this case, you should pay a third.
Yeah, there's a chiyuv midifnei mishuras hadin in grama.
Wait, in grama you do pay?
Yeah, you're pater, but there's a chiyuv, there's a responsibility midifnei mishuras hadin to pay a third.
So in the case of the pipe, you'd pay 1/3 of the cost of repairing the pipe.
If you
Whether or not
if you accept the responsibility, if you accept the chiyuv of lifnei mishuras hadin.
But you don't even have to accept it.
you don't have to accept it. But again,
Unless you're the kind of person that would accept it, then you have to accept it.
yeah, very good.
That's a pretty interesting standard for
Yes.
people that are like, I'm not one of the good types. You know?
Yeah. But
Like,
that was my
they're a bit of
but
a
that was
middle.
my point in relating it to here because there are privileges that go with that. Because a person who accepts that as a chiyuv then causes God is then mechayev, right? Requires God to do the same thing for him, and in such a case, doing so would not be bribery. That was the point here. That's not bribery. That makes it din. There, he's causing God to act with him milifni shor din, the halacha.
Aren't mitzvahs bribery then? Like you do mitzvahs and it's like a.
That's required. Chiyuv to do mitzvah.
And, yes, you're required to do the mitzvahs, and you get reward for doing so.
Okay.
But it's not necessarily
So this
bribery.
is just the same as like a mitzvah.
This is going beyond the mitzvah. I think that's the point. That this is going beyond the requirement. You're not required to go beyond the letter of the law.
Okay.
But if you choose to do so, then Hashem tzilcha yad yaminecha, God shadows you on the right. We said right is chesed. It's a beautiful, somewhat intricate idea. Again, it's huh? Yes, yeah, and it's not so explicit in the text. I mean, you have to see that this is what he's suggesting. I believe. Kadosh Baruch Hu so he says here. So these people, then, these are the people who are acting in the attribute of Chesed LaAvraham. Kadosh Baruch Hu misnaeg b'midas Chesed im oisom shehem kmo Avraham b'hanhagasam. God acts, therefore, in a way with Chesed with his people, which is akin to the Chesed of Avraham, where the giving is giving for giving's sake. And it's related to the idea of going lifni mishur sedin, which is beyond the call of duty, which is overlooking what should be required according to strict judgment, consistently. That's a nice way of explaining it. Yeah, you can if you want to be a giving person, even though people don't deserve it, you can give a little bit to many people, and this way you're not spoiling them and they're not particularly taking advantage of you, because you only get. That's one explanation. Another. Well, go ahead. What were you going to suggest?
I don't know. I don't think you're spoiling anybody. Even when you give money just to a homeless person, and there's a high probability that they're going to buy drugs with it or alcohol. I don't think it's even. You're still giving for the sake of giving, and if it's not, you don't know exactly what that person's going to do, and even though it's likely, it's not really your place to judge, what they're going to do with that money. You're being charitable, and it's the way I look at it is maybe for you it's good because you're learning to disattach yourself from money in general, so it's kind of like you have a benefit for severing the like emotional tie to money, right? And then by bestowing kindness onto somebody else, they're more likely to reciprocate it. Maybe they are a drug addict, but maybe the very act of kindness might spur something in their mind. It's like look at the way other people are. So you never know.
Yeah, no.
And even if they're drug addicts, they still need to get food.
They still need to get
spend
food
their money
and
on like whatever.
Yeah, the only thing is that, if you're giving for giving's sake, that should imply that the giving should be good. It should be really giving and not.
I'm not going to give to the KKK. It depends on who.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give to like people who have like kids who are addicts or whatever, and they support them and like pay their rent and give them money. Like that's not really helping them. That's more damaging them. Is what you're saying.
Yes. So that
giving to them would be like somehow giving them help.
Yes.
As opposed
yes.
to
Yes. I would think that while I agree with the spirit of what you're saying, still the responsibility to give in a way which is good and not going to be harmful would probably require you to take the spirit of what you're saying and say give to that person. Maybe and not necessarily not give.
Food for them,
but give him a loaf of bread, or say, you've got $10 credit in the supermarket. Go get for yourself what you'd like, something like that. So then, you're fulfilling both the spirit of what you're saying and also practically doing something which is beneficial for the person. Yeah.
You say this concept where more than the child wants to nourish from the mother wants to give more.
Yeah.
It's a chazal like that.
Yeah, Chazal said that. Yeah.
The mother wants to give more than
Yeah. So that's very good. That's a very nice source that's very relevant to this. It's very relevant to this. The idea of giving for giving's sake.
But that's in the case of the nursing and milk. I mean, that's the mother. That's in the mother. But you get out into the real world, you do that.
Well, it's true that you have to protect yourself and protect the interests of the people who are relying on you and so forth and so on. But we're talking here not only to giving materially, of course, that's just one example, but we're talking about nurturing people emotionally, giving to people intellectually, sharing your talents in general. So this would be, the broad spectrum of human endeavor. One should be in a situation of giving. And it doesn't mean to say that you should give indiscriminately. The point is just that this is adding to the previous midah, saying that when one gives, he should give not only the intention of filling a person's need, but focus on giving for the sense of giving. Like he said, in a way, it's giving which is taking. Because in a way, I mean, it's giving which is good for you. Like you said, you're severing your ties to your money, or you're inculcating yourself to share your talents and strength with others. So of course there's going to be the element where even if you're going to do that, you should seek to do it with people who are going to derive tangible benefit from what you're doing, because they need it. It's fulfilling a need. But your focus on the giving is not just to fulfill the need, but it's actually to elevate yourself even higher than that and make yourself a better person by the act of giving itself. Like the Rambam says, and this is touching his point as well, what's better to give $100 to one person or $1 to 100? Rambam says $1 to 100, because it inculcates within you the act of giving, small amounts to many people. So you're not, in this way, you're not, what did you say, spoiling one person by giving him just $100. You're giving $1 to 100 people, reinforcing the act of giving. Let's try in the minutes that we have just to finish off this section. How do we translate now? Let's just continue on, move this strain that we're going into in the text itself, translating this midah into practical living. Gama adam im hiyos she'im kol adam hiye misnag b'tzedek b'yoshev mishpat. So to a person, if with other people, he's always acting according to the strict letter of the law. Im hatoivim ve'achasidim tehanogaso lifnim mishur. Regarding the good people, the righteous people, the holy people, the people who themselves are consistently giving to others, these you should certainly act within the letter of the law for. So in the previous section, he was talking about a person might say, well, people who act according to the letter of the law, I'll act with the letter of the law. And people who go beyond that, I'll go beyond with them. We said a person shouldn't do that. He shouldn't make the distinction. Yeah? But even here he's saying, even a person were to do that, he should still emphasize very strongly the idea of consistently being benevolent and magnanimous, to those who are consistently like that themselves. And you should give them special deferential treatment. That's the point. So, righteous people, holy people, pious people, ethical Torah scholars, and I say ethical because not every Torah scholar is ethical, but a proper ethical, pious Torah scholar would be somebody to give preferential, deferential treatment to. Because if your assumption should be, and all the more so if you know that this person is consistently giving and self-sacrificing for others, so you should do that for him. Just like, and in that case, you have to say, based on our explanation in the first paragraph, it's more than that. Not just that you should, but you must. It's like a halacha. Since this person requires God to act with him that way, we are talking about emulating God, so we become required to do the same thing. And this might explain how, if you have, for example, charity money, you're actually required to give to the Torah scholar first, and other types of preferential treatment is a requirement. According to this, maybe that's what this is coming from. What were you going to say, Ben?
Exactly what you said.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you probably put the idea in my mind. V'im nashar ha'adam hayasavlan k'tzas, and if with other people he was, let's say, using the previous midah by being patient with them a little bit, or maybe what he's saying is, if for other people who are, let's say, milifni mishur sidin, he's generally patient with them, le'elu for the people who are consistently and significantly in the midah of Chesed LaAvraham, where they give just for giving's sake, Le'elu yoser v'yoser, to these you should give more and more, and constantly looking for opportunities to give to them and to benefit them and to share with them and so forth and so on. V'yirachem alehem, and to have mercy on them, Likones emehem lifnim mishuras hadin, to be constantly acting them in a way which is within the letter of the law, Shehu misnaheg ba im shar ha'adam, which is the attribute that this person himself acts with others. So just like God acts that way with him, mi'ikar din, because that's how he acts with others, so we should also act that way with him. Our emulating God would require that we also act that way with him as well. And these pious, holy, righteous, giving, generous individuals should be very, very important in his eyes. Not just important to his eyes, like the people discussed in the previous chapter, but very, very important to his eyes. V'chavivim lo, and they should be beloved by him, desired by him. V'hem hiyu mi'anshe kevraso, and these are the people who he should try and make his cronies, his friends, the people who he socializes with and interacts with, in order to benefit them and benefit from them, and so forth and so on. Okay, very good. Let's end here.